A few days ago, a guy on Discord, a newer player to Rise to War, asked me if I could break down sort of the stages of a Rise to War season, the phases of a Rise to War season, I guess you could call them. So this is going to be a bit of an abstract video, but I'm going to do my best to break down each of the phases of a season in Rise to War and sort of what you should be pushing for if you're a newer player or maybe haven't played with a large organized group yet. Hopefully I can sort of define some of these things so that people have more concrete objectives that they can be working for as they're playing either by themselves or with their teams. I don't have any like good PvP B-roll footage laying around to play in the background while I'm talking. So I guess you guys are just going to have to look at my pretty face. Let's get into it. All right, I managed to find at least a little bit of fighting going on, so you guys can watch that as I talk. So the first phase we're going to go ahead and call the early game, and granted, keep in mind that all of this is subject to change based on what season you're in, what server you're in, how competitive your group is, how competitive the other groups on your server are. I've had seasons where I've been PvPing from day 4 until almost the end of the server. I've had servers where I've had like 2 weeks to just play Farmville. So a lot of it's going to depend, but I'm going to try and generalize it here. So phase 1, the early game, is going to last about 2 weeks. Your main objective during this time is going to be leveling your commanders, filling up your economy on 130 and 150 power tiles preferably, and take at least one 200 plus power tile so that you can mock battle, aka mind sharpen your commanders, as it is now one of the best ways of gaining EXP in the game. As far as your faction goals, in my opinion, you want to secure farmland. So you'll be taking low-level keeps so that people can start branching out, assuming your faction has access to low-level keeps. And you'll just kind of want to start spreading out into what you believe your safe borders will be. So for example, if that's Linden, that's probably everything west of Anuminas, at least in the early game. That's all relatively safe land. If you're somebody like Gondor, you just want to be taking all of these southern keeps that are relatively difficult for other factions to get to. It's important during this phase of the game that your faction is able to build an economy in a relatively safe location so that when the PvP starts, you can have resources to constantly be fighting. I've seen on multiple occasions factions that were relatively strong, as soon as their farmland gets hit, they just start crumbling because their players can no longer afford to constantly conscript. There's a big difference in people's morale when they're able to conscript 4 full queues, potentially 5 full queues if you have a hireable unit overnight. You wake up, you have plenty of troops to use. You know, that's just much better for your morale than if you're basically doing like 20-minute conscriptions because you're scraping the bottom of the barrel in terms of resources. So level your commanders, build at least somewhat of an economy, and sort of start branching out to your borders or what you think will be safe borders going forward. Obviously, do diplomacy with the factions around you and probably every faction that's on your server. Start getting some feelers for what they view as their land, and try to not to step on anybody's toes quite yet. Mid game, I'm going to say, is roughly weeks 3 to 6. Mid game is a bit more difficult to define in terms of the exact time span because it can vary wildly from server to server, but we'll say approximately weeks 3 to 6. At this point, you want to be pushing at least 2 of your commanders to level 50. If you have to, just PvP with 1 commander and leave 1 commander at home, mock battling, sweeping, taking tiles, doing whatever. The important thing is you have to keep growing, or else some other faction is going to outgrow you. The difficult part in this phase of the game is managing the early wars that are going to happen, as well as continuing to grow. I think that's one of the things that my group has gotten good at over all the seasons that we've been playing together, is we've sort of somehow just kind of learned how to grow and also be at war at the same time. I think a lot of that is because our first few seasons, we were pretty much at war for the entirety of the first 2 seasons. So we just had to do it, right? So you want at least 2 level 50s at this point in the game, preferably more. I mean, don't go crazy and try to have like 12 level 50 commanders or anything. And what you'll want to be doing is you want to make sure that all of the keeps that you consider like your safe land, your heartland borders, whatever you want to call it, you want all of those secured at this point. And as far as wars go, you're going to have long cooldowns between wars, but you want to make sure that you're able to push for some objective every single time your wars are up. You really don't want to be sitting on a war cooldown during, or like sitting with your war available, I should say, during this phase of the game. Because it has such a long cooldown, you want to make the most out of your wars. So in between wars, you want to make sure your borders are safe, you're pathing towards your next objective. Always have a next objective in mind for your members to work towards. And then once your war is available, you want to make sure that you're able to take an objective. I did just say that you want to be using your wars every time they're up. I will have a caveat on that, in that you don't want to blow a war and then miss out on an objective. It'll be better to wait a little while longer if you can clear more forts out of an area or just have a more safe objective to take. It's going to be better to go ahead and spend that extra little time to make sure you get the objectives. So the other thing you want to do, and this is a really abstract sort of idea, is you want to put your faction, if possible, in a position to contest Dol Guldur. What I mean by that is you want to make sure your faction has some adjacent region to DG. If you're allied with somebody and they say, hey, we want every single territory that borders the ring, they're probably not a good ally for you. You want to either split the land, like, we get 3, you get 4, we get 2, you get 4. However you guys decide to split it up, that's up to you. You just want to make sure that you have a path to the ring and that you will be able to fight for the ring in some way. A lot of that's going to be up to however the diplomacy is on your guy's server, but that's a really important part of closing out the mid game, is making sure that when the time comes, your faction actually has a shot at winning. Now, obviously, that's not always going to be possible. On some servers, your faction is just kind of get steamrolled. Maybe you don't have to worry about that one, but generally speaking, by the mid game, the late mid game, I want to make sure that my faction has some way to make a play for the ring. And then the late game is kind of whatever time is left in the season. That might be like 3 or 4 more weeks after the mid game. This is the point where wars only have 12-hour rather than 48-hour cooldown. By this point in the season, you need to make sure that you have an economy that can sustain constant fighting. If you don't have full 130s and 150s by this point, you're really far behind. I'll go ahead and show you guys my tile breakdowns from this past season. This was a relatively chill season. I farmed a lot less than I probably could have, but I have 8200 power tiles, 16 230 power tiles, 4 260s, and 4 300s. Everything else that I have is a 130 or a 150. I mean, you can see from my resource income in general, I have a very solid economy. You need an economy that's able to fight constantly, because on competitive servers, the wars at this point in the season are pretty much never going to stop, because all the neutral land is taken. People are struggling to push for the ring, protect their homeland, protect their capital for season rewards, that sort of thing. So you need to be able to constantly be running conscription queues and your apothecary. So don't neglect building your economy during the mid game, and even at the beginning of the late game. You want to be building your economy kind of as you move across the map. The way I've described it to people in the past is like embrace your inner Genghis Khan. Take the resources that you need from your enemies. Just pillage, plunder, steal. Get what you need in order to keep fighting, and keep those resources out of their hands as well. There's tons of tiles in this game, so don't get discouraged and think that, oh man, I don't have a good enough economy right now. Go out there, fight, get the tiles, take those resources away from your enemies. They're out there, you just have to work for them. I would also recommend saving your apothecary boosts for this phase of the game, because during the mid game when wars have 48 hours of cooldown, for the most part, the only time you really have to worry about getting pushed back in any major way is during the 24-hour period of an enemy's war, and then you have 2 days to breathe. In the late game, it's going to be 24 hours of war, 12 hours to breathe, and then I guess 18 because it takes 6 to then activate the war. But 18 is still a lot less than 48 hours, and another 24 hours of war, etc., etc. What I would recommend if you're like a fellowship or warband leader at this phase in the game, use Discord, use in-game announcements, use whatever to do 2 to 3 coordinated pushes each day. So maybe your objective is going to be, we need to take the Shire back because we want to have the Hobbit pipeweed for ourselves. Set these types of objectives, be clear in your communication. Say, all right, guys, we're going to start pushing for the Shire. And in order to get there, maybe we need to take this crossing. So this could be the objective day one on Friday, whatever it is. So you can go ahead and say, all right, guys, at 11 UTC, at 16 UTC, and at 2300 UTC, we're going to have coordinated pushes to go ahead and clear these crossings, clear out all of these forts, etc., etc. The exact time obviously will be based on which hours your fellowship or warband is the most active. But doing these coordinated pushes can be a huge morale boost because people can feel like they're actually gaining ground, working as part of a team. And if you're able to push and take territory, it then becomes easier to hold that ground because you can do things like stack on 200 power tiles, stack on choke points if you're taking those choke points away from your enemy, things like that. So if you're a player, try to attend as many of these types of pushes as you possibly can to contribute to your faction as much as possible. If your leaders aren't scheduling these sort of pushes and you're kind of just grinding away over some type of choke point or crossing, maybe suggest that to them. Let's start doing multiple pushes a day. I would say you want to juggle up the time a little bit. You don't want to be predictable. You don't want your enemy to know, okay, it's 1900 again. I guess they're going to come smack the crossing. The other thing you can do is try to find ways around these choke points if you can. You don't want to spend your a week fighting over this one crossing going into the Shire. Not always possible, but just another little thing that I wanted to throw out there. And obviously, in the late game phase of the season, the most important thing is you want to actually take Dol Guldur, since that is the objective, at least of, I guess not every season now, but most seasons, the objective obviously is to control the One Ring. Make sure that you find time to make that happen. In Rebuilding Glory, this thing has absolutely absurd faction boosts, which can really make or break future wars. If it's a competitive server, if you're able to take the ring, take advantage of those boosts, that could be the last thing that you need to put the nail in the coffin of your enemy's grave. Alright guys, that was a bit of a long video, a bit of an abstract video, but hopefully it gives you a clearer picture of kind of what you want to be working towards as a player or as a fellowship/warband leader in this game. Thank you for watching.